Well, hi everybody. Thank you for being here. Eager to listen to this presentation, whose title is COVID Response, Difficulties to Build Intelligence for the Peruvian Public Health System. As you may imagine, I am going to share some experience related to how we analyze the data, we organize it, to provide recommendations for the higher authorities, and all the process we went by and discussions and things like that. Okay, so just to give you a brief abstract of what you're going to see, or just to contextualize a little in this presentation, uh, I want to tell you maybe a couple of things. First, that when we speak about COVID, the COVID pandemic, it is a pandemic that hit very, very hard, Peru, right? By the end of 2020, Peru arguably have already reached one of the highest peaks. Was a top country that suffered the most related to deaths in the world, right? And this situation, of course, brought a lot of discomfort, particularly political discomfort, and so this was also accompanied by several political crises in parallel, right? This political crisis replaced several, well, top decision makers several times, right? And every time we have this cohort of political decision makers, and I mean real political decision makers, not data analysts, right? All the people that were involved in building intelligence for making decisions had, of course, different questions. Were different things around what was needed as an input for the decisions at the top level of the country, right? Um, Nevertheless, it is not like a linear relationship between what the data was telling us or what we can foresee from the data and the behavior of the population and the decisions that the political elite took, but also seeing that there were always some kind of measures, right? However, the obedience of the people to those measures, after the discussions we have technically, politically, were not did not remain the same in terms of obedience, right? Well, at the beginning, there was a lot of obedience. Maybe a year later, right? Even though we proposed, or there were several other measures proposed, we were very concerned that due to the fact that it impacted the whole population, we were very concerned that people really will accomplish or follow the measures, or had obedience to the measures that were proposed. In fact, we're really sure that they decrease dramatically as time passes by. Mhm. And this is I want to start with this. This is a general picture of how it went in Peru related to death. This is maybe the most trustable data that we have from several others that were used. And today we know that we had more than 200,000 confirmed deaths from COVID, right? But the biggest share was for the first two waves, right? In the third wave, which is currently declining, currently waning, the highest peak reached around 1,400 cases, while in the first wave the peak was about 4,500 cases, and in the second wave it was around 5,700 cases in a week. Right? Um, Following the same behavior of deaths, I may show you. I am maybe showing you something very atypical for most countries, right? And it is the presence of four different presidents of the country, right? In general, I believe that most countries have one president during their time, or maybe two, right? but there were difficult, very difficult, very serious problems during the COVID time. And then speaking of approximately 2 years, okay, 2 years and a half. But in that time, we have different presidents. We started with President Vizcarra, who was already a vice president that replaced a president that was impeached previously. That sorry, well, he really declined the presidency. Okay, so President Vizcarra, as vice president, was in place. However, due to several problems that were discovered during his mandate, he was replaced for a short period of time with another president, President Merino. Again, this president there was so much opposition during that time that in a couple of weeks he left office, and then came another appointed president that the named by the Congress of the country, who stayed around 8 months, right? And since July 2021, there was a new president elected, President Castillo. Okay, and of course, imagine that the whole country, starting in 2020, had this major concern about how to manage COVID. But there, of course, the other problems did not disappear. Other problems related to hunger, related to economic development, and so on and so on, were still there, right? But imagine that these are the presidents that had to deal with this situation in general that touch almost every activity in the country, right? And in parallel, I want to show you how many secretaries of health were there were appointed during those times, right? There was during President Vizcarra had two secretaries of health in just a year, in less than a year, right? President Merino brought another secretary of health who also left 2 weeks later, right? One of the last minister of Vizcarra, the last secretary of health of Vizcarra returned for a short period. That was Dr. Massetti, and she stayed maybe a couple of months for two months or something, and then came another secretary of health, Dr. Ugarte, right, and he remained until the President Castillo came. For a long time, compared to the others, Secretary Ceballos stayed in office, maybe more than 7 months, and he was just replaced a couple of weeks ago, but another Secretary of Health, Secretary Condori. Notice that all of this situation, all this political situation and technical situation, right, was and all of these waves. It is not like we have one phenomenon that was easy to understand, right? In parallel, we were detecting different variants of COVID, but we know that today. We didn't know that in that moment, right? So there was the ancestral one, and then there was the lambda one, and there was the gamma one, and there was the delta, and there was the omicron, currently discovered just by the end. The present omicron was just discovered around the end of last year, right? By almost the last week of December, right? So this is the whole scenario, the whole complexity, right, of the situation that the data analytics team they have to live with all of these complexities, not only from the nature of the virus itself and all the variants, right, but also because different demands from the political layer and the managerial level, right? They were most of all of these top actors that you see as secretaries of health and presidents had different pressures during this time. So let me tell you about how we conducted the analysis there and other things that happened. And also keep in mind that the vaccination in Peru was started during the period of Secretary Ugarte, right? Which was around the beginning of the middle of March, right? Of course, the start of the vaccination in Peru was first just for the first line, right? Of I mean the doctors, right? The police, the army, the people that were involved, the closest to the citizen, right? And maybe around April, the middle of April, it started being more massive to the whole population, right? So, what happened to what? How did we deal? How the people dealing with the data dealt during the period of Secretary Zamora, right? As you will see for all of these, most of the responses were based on data about cases and data about death, right? So we learned to use, so we included more data, but they were not really the ones that had the weight, the high weight in decision making, right? And of course, several of the responses were also taking several of these measures were also adopted based on what other countries were doing, right? However, based on the information that we gave and the uncertainty at the moment of the very beginning of COVID, right? Most of the decisions were at the national level, right? So we closed the whole country was closed. Okay, transportation was there was no public transportation between provinces, so it was difficult to leave a province to go somewhere else, right? And from the beginning, only very basic services were allowed to operate, um, demanding that other services, even like restaurants, they could not work. There were just a service online, like other countries, right? You will also see that the constraints were a constant during all this time. The amount of ICU beds was um, a problem during up to today, right? We never the capacity was very low, lower than in every other neighbor in this part of the continent. The same thing for the production of oxygen, and of course, the, it was a difficult case related to data because we were all the time fighting with this idea, with this situation that the data was not updated on time. So in general, most of the any statistical summary that was produced, we truncated for the last 2 weeks. So we didn't use the last 2 weeks information because we knew it was very, very incomplete, right? And the same thing for the structure of the data, right? It was difficult to make matches or to merge data or integrate the data from different other sources because the data structures it was very difficult to make it compatible all the time, right? Um, so most of the forecasting at the beginning, you gotta find that with some they were based on some poison modeling. We didn't nobody there to do a forecasting on deaths, right? At least not officially, right? Um, and as I mentioned here, the scarcity of oxygen was not in the equation of decision makers. It was only late when sometimes you realize that oxygen was scarce, right? And then you realize that there was not enough production of oxygen in the country for the situation at the beginning of pandemics. I mean, by the second month, right? You can also see that all the decisions were made at the top level of government, at the national level. So there was no much local government involvement in those situations, right? This also forced some unexpected migration. Most of the people that live in the coast come from the highlands or rural areas. So they decided to move back to their area of origin. Uh, when there was new appointment during President Vizcarra of Secretary Massetti, right? The data was the same. However, the decision was not to talk about the country as a whole, but as the region of the country or departments, as we say in Peru, right? Um, the airport started operating based on the information that we had. They mainly believe that the main idea is, well, we already had COVID here, and we need to live with that idea to be responsible about that. But we also need to open the frontiers because the impact on the economy has to be managed in a way, right? Um, in this moment, we had a better idea of what, well, we believe we have a better idea what was going on. There was more literature on modeling. So all the technical people were more started doing some other um, modeling efforts and like Sayer. Um, and we still have this problem of counting deaths. Uh, it is something interesting, and I want to share that by that time, some people believe, some experts or some economists believe that the COVID would be over soon, so that after the first wave, there was no chance of a second wave. Okay, so it is the, but there is the beginning of the second wave. Okay, by the end of 2020, the beginning of 2021, with a different variant too. Uh, and we kept the regional focus, but it was very hard because we started. Uh, there was so much discussion about if we will have a second wave or not a second wave, that at the end there was less emphasis on forecasting or advanced modeling, and there was more interest how to given COVID is here, how to reactivate the economy. Right there, we were not people, top decision makers were not interested anymore in solving the health problem, but to live with that as a condition in general, right? This gave to a particular denial of the second wave, so the capacity was reduced, was impacted by that, right? So it hit very hard and very quickly the second wave. Okay, and by the time Secretary Huarte was appointed, there was a hope, right? The vaccination will start, and it happened, right? There was this high increase of the second wave, which ended by the beginning of April, and then a slow decline started in the case of deaths. Okay, and it was accompanied by the process of vaccination, right? In that moment, since that time, since the beginning of February, middle of February, we abandon the regional lockdown idea, and then we go to a promised lockdown idea. So that's the next administrative unit, right? There will be just one more, which will be the city or the district, as we call it here, right? So the province is like a county. So in the United States terms. So then we started all the discussion, which remains up to today, was based on the amount of cases, based on the amount of deaths, what provinces should be totally closed or can be open, or or we can have some not so restrictive regulations related to the max occupancy of the restaurants and casinos, or churches, or movie theaters, right? Um, and this decline, of course, it gave opportunity for different sectors to start thinking about the whole reactivation, right? So more than an interest in how the cases or how the deaths can be modeled, the idea was more, all the effort was more on the procurement of vaccination. How fast can we vaccinate, right? How far can we get with the vaccination? Um, we were never sure if the cases were a good indicator, right? Because it is just an opportunistic situation, right? You go to a place and you take a test, And if you take more tests, you will find more cases. You take less tests, you will have less cases, right? So relying on the death data, we saw that there is this steady decline. So politically, the decision was, well, to put all what was needed into the procurement of vaccination for the whole population, right? And the last presidential period, right? Well, the province lockdown remained. There were minimal restrictions in the airports, right? And the service started being differentiated if you were vaccinated or not. Okay, there if you were vaccinated, you can have in general access to a top occupancy, right, of the service you wanted to use. And in the case of modeling the cases, again, there was a request, right, that we have a different algorithm if in case the positive cases were increasing or they were decreasing. In the case they were decreasing, only cases would matter, right? And deaths. But in the case that they were increasing, then the amount of ICUs, the amount of vaccination, and the amount of oxygen available per province, as you see in the plot, were going to be considered in the equation to say which province is in the worst situation and should lock down and which is not. Fortunately, none of the countries really achieved the total lockdown during the third wave, this third small wave, right? But they achieved some level of lockdown of some restrictions. However, most of them didn't achieve terrible levels of this. And we were dealing with the end of Delta presence and the beginning of Omicron presence at that time, right? Currently, as of today, they will starting today, in fact, February 28th, there will be no more restrictions on seat capacity indoors, right? As long as you're vaccinated. Just some concluding remarks. As you may see, out of this complexity, it was very difficult to accumulate knowledge for the people in charge of preparing intel to the government. You know? As political changes did not keep a consistent nor coherent vision. You know? These inconsistencies were accompanied by a lack of surveillance of the measurement. I mean, there were restrictions for almost every activity, precisely, right? Restriction for to go to the tailor, to go to do your hair, to go to mass, to go to a casino, to go to a stadium, to go to a sauna, to go to a gym. So for every activity, there were some level of restriction for a province at the province level at the end. How many people can? What was the share of the seat capacity or the max seating capacity allowed to be there, right? So, but the fact is, it was so atomic, right? So subatomic. These measures that, of course, we were pretty sure that only the most formal and the bigger the organization or the job, they are the ones who will comply with this. While the small businesses or the informal businesses, they may not comply, and there was, even though of course it was against the law, it, the police or the army had no capacity to go into what every one of the business available, right? By this time, we have around the 80% of the population vaccinated. No? That's what explains that the political decision currently is that lower as much as possible the measures, right? However, we're gonna be keep an eye open because the capacity to prevent death is still the lowest compared to the region. Well, thank you very much for allowing me to share this experience that I have organized in this way, and I thank you again for being here.